The country was born before anyone asked if it should live. The sound that marked its creation was not celebration, but exhaustion. Cannons had barely cooled. Cities were still counting their dead. The smoke of one war lingered in the air when a new idea was declared necessary, urgent, inevitable. In the shattered center of Europe's southeast, diplomats leaned over, maps stained with fingerprints, and fatigue, drawing lines that tried to simplify what history had never allowed to be simple. Yugoslavia did not emerge from unity. It emerged from fear. Fear that the region, left alone, would collapse back into ancient rivalries. Fear that borders rooted in ethnicity and memory would produce endless war. Fear that only something larger, something imposed, could hold the fragments together. So a country was assembled like a barricade meant, not to inspire belonging, but to prevent catastrophe. 6 peoples, multiple religions, languages that sounded similar but carried different ghosts. They were told they were now one. In the villages, the announcement arrived quietly. A new flag, a new name, new promises spoken in distant capitals. Farmers returned to fields that had changed hands too many times to count. Priests, imams, and Orthodox monks resumed rituals older than the state itself. The land absorbed the decree without comment. The mistake was subtle, and therefore fatal. Yugoslavia was not built from shared identity. It was built to suppress identity. The architects believed that if difference could be folded into a single structure, conflict would dissolve, that history could be neutralized by administration, that memory, given time, would forget itself. What they did not understand was that memory does not fade when it is ignored. It hardens.
Some countries are born from history. Others are assembled from urgency, fear, and the hope that differences can be held together by force. Yugoslavia was not forged by a single people or a shared past. It was constructed to contain conflict, a political solution to centuries of rivalry, layered identities, and unresolved wounds. We examine why unity failed, how ideology replaced identity, and why a nation can exist on paper long before it exists in the hearts of its people. I'm Rayo, and here we don't just study nations. We ask whether they were ever meant to survive.
The first Yugoslavia leaned on monarchy to hold it together. Authority stood where consent had not yet formed. When that authority collapsed, the structure revealed its weakness instantly. The Second World War tore the illusion apart with extraordinary violence. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Atrocities were not imported, they erupted from within. The land remembered everything it had been asked to forget. When the war ended, the idea should have died. Instead, it was resurrected. This time, with force. From the ashes rose a figure who understood the country's true nature better than its creators ever had. He did not believe in Yugoslavia as harmony. He believed in Yugoslavia as containment. Josip Broz Tito had watched the region tear itself apart and concluded that unity would never come from love. It would come from fear, carefully managed, evenly distributed. Under him, Yugoslavia became a state of balance held at gunpoint. Nationalism was not erased. It was buried. Languages were standardized. Symbols were controlled. History was rewritten into something flatter, safer, less specific. Brotherhood and unity were not aspirations. They were commands. The state did not ask its peoples to forget who they were. It demanded that they remain silent about it. For a time, it worked. The country functioned not because it had resolved its contradictions, but because it froze them. Tito stood above ethnic lines, a figure powerful enough to intimidate them all equally. His authority was not abstract. It was personal. It was visible in uniforms, parades, and prisons. The message was clear. The past would not be allowed to speak. Yugoslavia did not heal. It stabilized. Factories rose, cities expanded. Borders opened just enough to suggest freedom without risking fracture. The West saw a socialist state that did not fully belong to the East. The East saw a communist state that refused submission. Yugoslavia became a geopolitical anomaly admired, tolerated, misunderstood. Inside, the silence held. Families remembered which names could not be spoken, which holidays were observed quietly, behind closed doors, which stories were told only to children old enough to understand danger. Identity survived the way it always does under pressure. Privately, stubbornly, patiently. Tito aged. The system aged with him. What held Yugoslavia together was never ideology. It was gravity. The gravity of one man, one myth, one authority strong enough to keep 6 histories from colliding. When he died, the silence did not break immediately. It cracked. No one replaced him. No one cool. The country continued out of habit, out of fear of what would happen if it stopped. Power dispersed into committees, presidencies, rotating authorities designed to prevent dominance. What they actually prevented was decision. Without a center strong enough to suppress division, division began to breathe. The economy faltered. Not catastrophically at first, just enough to expose fault lines. Scarcity does what ideology cannot. It forces questions. Who pays? Who benefits? Who suffers? Old grievances resurfaced, wearing the language of fairness and reform. The past learned to speak in modern terms. Nationalism did not return as a scream. It returned as a whisper, a suggestion that one group was working harder than the others, that one history had been minimized, that one identity had paid the highest price for unity. Politicians learned quickly that memory was currency, that grievance mobilized faster than hope ever could. The country began to pull against itself. Each republic looked inward, recalculating its place inside a structure that no longer felt inevitable. Yugoslavia had always required force to exist. Now, force was fragmented, uncertain, hesitant. The system designed to prevent dominance had made confrontation unavoidable. The original error surfaced fully at last. A country created to prevent conflict had postponed it. A unity enforced by silence had preserved resentment intact. A state that should never have existed without consent now faced the moment when consent could no longer be ignored. The tragedy was no longer a possibility. It was scheduled. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured. Economic strain turned neighbors into competitors. Factories that once symbolized shared progress now stood as proof of unequal burden. Roads, ports, and power stations were counted not as national assets, but as regional leverage. Who had built more? Who had given more? Who was being held back? The questions multiplied, and with them, the answers hardened. Language changed. Politicians stopped speaking of unity and began speaking of fairness. Then of rights, then of protection. Each word peeled back a layer of restraint that had held for decades. History re-entered public space, not as scholarship, but as accusation. Old flags appeared in corners and crowds. Old songs resurfaced, sung softly at first, then louder, then without apology. What had been buried was learning to breathe again. Television screens filled with faces that spoke directly to memory. They did not invent grievances. They curated them. They arranged the past into clean narratives, with villains and victims, heroes and betrayals. Every republic heard a different story about the same country, and each story felt complete, convincing, urgent. The state still existed on paper. In reality, it was dissolving into competing truths. Federal institutions hesitated, paralyzed by the very balance meant to preserve them. Every decision required consensus among those who no longer believed in a shared future. The army, once the ultimate guarantor of unity, found itself pulled in opposing directions. Its ranks reflecting the fractures it was meant to suppress. Trust evaporated. Meetings ended without agreement. Promises were made without conviction. Each side prepared quietly for the moment when words would no longer suffice. The country moved toward conflict, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate tightening, like a knot drawn by many hands at once. Nationalism shed its defensive mask. Borders that had once been administrative lines were reimagined as historical truths. Villages were reclassified. Names were corrected. Cemeteries became evidence. Every stone carried meaning now. Every church bell and minaret marked territory not just of faith, but of belonging. The first shots did not announce a war. They announced permission. Once blood was spilled, restraint lost its last argument. Militias formed with frightening speed, drawing on networks older than the state itself. Weapons appeared from caches everyone pretended not to know about. The memory of the last great violence never truly resolved returned. with precision. Neighbors watched neighbors differently. The question was no longer who you were, but what you were. Names became dangerous. Accents mattered. Family histories were interrogated, not for curiosity, but for classification. The logic of coexistence collapsed under the pressure of fear. Cities that had lived together for generations tore themselves apart, street by street. Sarajevo learned what it meant to be surrounded by its own past. Shells arced over hills that had once held picnics and prayer. Snipers turned everyday movement into calculation. Water, food, light, everything became precious. The city endured not because it was strong, but because leaving would have meant surrendering identity itself. Elsewhere, towns emptied overnight. Columns of refugees stretched across roads, carrying mattresses, photographs. Children too young to understand why their homes had suddenly become hostile. Old people stayed behind, convinced that history would spare them this time. History did not. The war did not spread evenly. It followed fault lines drawn decades earlier by administrators who believed difference could be managed if it were ignored. Those lines now guided artillery and checkpoints. What had been artificial borders became real through blood. The international world watched, stunned. They had believed Yugoslavia was stable, that its complexity was proof of success, that its past had been neutralized by time and modernity. What they saw instead was the consequence of postponement, the return of suppressed identities with the force of something denied for too long. Peace conferences convened as cities burned. Maps were unfolded again, lines reconsidered, compromises proposed too late to matter. Each negotiation assumed a shared desire to preserve something, but the country itself was no longer the goal. Survival was. Dominance was. Separation felt safer than coexistence. The violence escalated, not because it was chaotic, but because it was systematic. Ethnic cleansing did not erupt spontaneously. It followed logic. Remove the other. Secure continuity. Make return impossible. Villages were emptied with methodical cruelty. Lists were consulted. Doors were marked. The past was not just remembered, it was enforced. The world searched for a moment where it could have intervened decisively. There were many, but each was clouded by hesitation, by the belief that this was ancient hatred resurfacing, rather than a modern failure maturing exactly as designed. Yugoslavia was not collapsing because its people were incompatible. It was collapsing because incompatibility had been denied until it could only express itself through violence. The bloodshed did not surprise those who understood the original error. A country created without consent, held together by force, and maintained by silence cannot survive the moment when force weakens and silence breaks. The violence was not an aberration. It was the structure revealing its true shape. And as mass graves filled and borders solidified through fear, the title proved itself with unbearable clarity. This was not a nation unraveling. This was a tragedy completing itself. The blood did not fall evenly. It followed the logic that had always been there, waiting. What had once been coexistence turned into geography of fear. Hills became firing positions. Rivers became borders overnight. Streets that had carried weddings and funerals alike were renamed by who controlled them after dusk. The war did not ask permission. It did not need to. The country had already been dismantled in the mind long before it was destroyed on the ground. Militias learned quickly. They learned how to separate, how to question, how to decide who belonged and who did not. Identity became a checkpoint. A surname could decide whether a door opened or never would again. Religion, once practiced quietly beside neighbors of other faiths, hardened into a marker of survival. The war was not fought only with bullets. It was fought with memory sharpened into accusation. The most terrifying thing was how familiar it all felt. The methods were not new. They had been rehearsed decades earlier, during the last great collapse, when the first Yugoslavia tore itself apart under occupation and revenge. Those memories had never been reconciled. They had been buried. Now they returned intact, unfiltered, more dangerous for having waited so long. Sarajevo burned slowly, not in flames that consumed it all at once, but in days measured by survival. Shells fell with a rhythm. The city learned to recognize high ground, speaking to low ground, certainty, speaking to vulnerability. Snipers watched streets that had once belonged to everyone. Crossing an intersection became an act of faith, Children ran when told, not knowing why. Speed might save them. Art survived beside death. Music played in basements. Poetry was written by candlelight. People dressed carefully for funerals because dignity felt like resistance. The city endured not because it believed it would be saved, but because refusing to disappear was its final weapon. Elsewhere, there was no siege-only erasure. Villages emptied in hours. Houses burned methodically, not in rage, but in sequence. Fields were mined not to win battles, but to prevent return. The objective was not conquest, it was permanence. To make the idea of Yugoslavia physically impossible, the world watched with disbelief that quickly turned into paralysis. Statements were issued. Condemnations followed. Lines were debated again, as they always had been. The same instruments that had created the country were now brought out to manage its collapse. But the violence did not pause for diplomacy. It accelerated. It had waited too long to be stopped by words. Peacekeepers arrived to keep a peace that did not exist. They stood between forces that did not fear them. They watched as rules failed in the face of intent. Neutrality became another form of helplessness. The war did not need international permission. It fed on momentum, on grievance validated by blood already spilled. The country broke apart exactly along the lines it had been told to forget. Each new state declared itself ancient, inevitable, justified. History was rearranged to make separation appear destiny rather than consequence. The idea of Yugoslavia was not debated anymore. It was ridiculed, treated as a naive experiment, a mistake finally corrected. But mistakes do not correct themselves. Te detonate. The final act was not surprising. It was confirmation. Mass graves were uncovered where silence had been demanded for generations. Bones told stories that documents never had. The past, once suppressed for the sake of unity, returned as evidence of why unity had never been real. Each discovery deepened division. Each truth, long denied, arrived without mercy. When the violence finally slowed, there was no relief, only exhaustion. Borders hardened into permanence. Flags changed, passports replaced shared citizenship. What had once been neighbors now required visas, explanations, distance. The land looked the same. The meaning of belonging did not. Yugoslavia did not die in a single moment. It fulfilled its design. A country created artificially, held together by force, maintained by silence, and denied the chance to reconcile its own history, was never meant to survive the moment when force weakened and silence broke. The explosion was not an accident. It was delayed ignition. The error was original. The consequence was inevitable. The tragedy was not that Yugoslavia collapsed. The tragedy was that it existed long enough to make its collapse catastrophic. In the end, the title does not shock. It explains. Yugoslavia was the country that should never have existed, not because its people could not live together, but because they were never allowed to decide how. Unity imposed from fear became violence released through memory. The presage was always there, written quietly beneath the surface of maps and slogans, and when history finally collected its debt, it did so with interest. The country vanished, the scars remained, and the lesson endured, etched into the ground where borders now stand. A nation built to silence its past will eventually hear it speak, and when it does, it will speak in blood.